Hello, 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 hello. Hôm nay là ngày mùng 5 tháng 8, 2024. Hôm nay vnindex xuống điên cuồng luôn. Khi mà đầu giờ, mình nhớ là khoảng tầm 10 giờ, 11 giờ mình xem thì trừ 20 điểm. Mà đến cuối giờ thì nó trừ đến 50 mấy điểm, mà chốt phiên là 48 điểm, âm 48 điểm. Một ít, nhưng mà cũng bắt đầu hơi căng thẳng khi mà gần đây mình cũng mua cũng khá nhiều, khoảng 2 đến 3 tháng trở lại đây. Rồi cứ long term 2-3 năm nữa sẽ hái quả ngọt nhỉ. Hôm nay mùng 5 tháng 8 và mình sẽ xem luôn cái podcast.
Built an entirely.
Okay.
Since I am interviewing Donald Trump,
Cool.
you want to stop by?
Yeah, sure. I'll stop in.
There was tragically an assassination attempt on Donald Trump. After this, you tweeted that you endorse him. What's your philosophy behind that endorsement? What do you hope Donald Trump does for the future of this country and for the future of humanity?
Well, I think there's, people tend to take, like, say, an endorsement as, well, I agree with everything that person has ever done their entire life 100% wholeheartedly. And that's not going to be true of anyone. But we have to pick, we've got two choices really for who's president. And it's not just who's president, but the entire administrative structure changes over. And I thought Trump displayed courage under fire, objectively. He's just got shot. He's got blood streaming down his face, and he's like fist pumping, saying "fight." That's impressive. Like, you can't feign bravery in a situation like that. Like, most people would be ducking. There would not be, because it could be a second shooter. You don't know. The president of the United States got to represent the country, and they're representing you. They're representing everyone in America. Well, like, you want someone who is strong and courageous to represent the country. That's not to say that he is without flaws. We all have flaws. But on balance, and certainly at the time, it was a choice of, fighting. Poor guy, has trouble climbing a flight of stairs. The other one's fist pumping after getting shot. This is no comparison. I mean, who do you want dealing with some of the toughest people and, other world leaders who are pretty tough themselves? And I'll tell you, like, what are the things that I think are important. I think we want a secure border. We don't have a secure border. We want safe and clean cities. I think we want to reduce the amount of spending that we're, at least slow down the spending. Because we're currently spending at a rate that is bankrupting the country. The interest payments on U.S. debt this year exceeded the entire Defense Department spending. If this continues, all of the federal government taxes will simply be paying the interest. And you keep going down that road, and you end up, in the tragic situation that Argentina had back in the day. Argentina used to be one of the most prosperous places in the world. And hopefully with Milei taking over, he can restore that. But it was an incredible fall from grace for Argentina to go from being one of the most prosperous places in the world to being very far from that. So I think we should not take American prosperity for granted. So we really want to, I think, we've got to reduce the size of government, we've got to reduce the spending, and we've got to live within our means.
Do you think politicians in general, governments, how much power do you think they have to steer humanity towards good?
There's a sort of age-old debate in history. Like, is history determined by these fundamental tides, or is it determined by the captain of the ship? Mm-hmm. This is both, really. I mean, there are tides, but it also matters who's captain of the ship. So So it's a false dichotomy, essentially. There's, I mean, there are certainly tides. The tides of history are, there are real tides of history. And these tides are often technologically driven. If you say like the Gutenberg press, the widespread availability of books as a result of a printing press, that was a massive tide of history, independent of any ruler. But I think in stormy times, you want the best possible captain of the ship.
Well, first of all, thank you for recommending Will and Ariel Durant's work. I've read the short one for now.
Oh, the
lessons of history. Lessons of history.
Yeah.
And so one of the lessons, one of the things they highlight is the importance of technology, technological innovation, and which is funny because they wrote so long ago, but they were noticing that the rate of technological innovation was speeding up.
Yeah,
I would love
really
to see what they think about now. But yeah, so to me, the question is how much government, how much politicians get in the way of technological innovation and building versus like help it, and which politicians, which kind of policies help technological innovation. Because that seems to be, if you look at human history, that's an important component of empires rising and succeeding.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in terms of dating civilization, the start of civilization, I think the start of writing, in my view, is that's what I think is probably the right starting point to date civilization. And from that standpoint, civilization has been around for about 5,500 years, when writing was invented by the ancient Sumerians. We're gone now, but the ancient Sumerians, in terms of getting a lot of firsts, those ancient Sumerians really have a long list of firsts. It's pretty wild. In fact, Durant goes through the list of like, you want to see firsts? We'll show you firsts. The Sumerians were just ass kickers. And then the Egyptians, who were right next door, relatively speaking, weren't that far, developed an entirely different form of writing, hieroglyphic. Cuneiform and hieroglyphic is totally different. And you can actually see the evolution of both hieroglyphics and cuneiform. Like the cuneiform starts off being very simple, and then it gets more complicated, and then towards the end it's like, wow, okay, they really get very sophisticated with the cuneiform. So I think of civilization as being about 5,000 years old. And Earth is, if physics is correct, 4.5 billion years old. So civilization has been around for 1/1,000,000th of Earth's existence. Flash in the pan.
Yeah, these are the early days. And so we
very early.
We make it very dramatic because there's been rises and falls and empires. And
so many rises and falls of empires. So many.
And there'll be many more.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, only a tiny fraction, probably less than 1% of what was ever written in history is available to us now. I mean, if they didn't literally chisel it in stone or put it in a clay tablet, we don't have it. Yeah. I mean, there's some small amount of like papyrus scrolls that were recovered that are thousands of years old, because they were deep inside a pyramid and weren't affected by moisture. But other than that, it's really got to be in a clay tablet or chiseled. So the vast majority of stuff was not chiseled because it takes a while to chisel things. So that's why we've got a tiny fraction of the information from history. But even that little information that we do have, and the archaeological record shows so many civilizations rising and falling. It's wild.
We tend to think that we're somehow different from those people. One of the other things that Durant highlights is that human nature seems to be the same. It just persists.
Yeah, I mean, the basics of human nature are more or less the same. Yeah.
So we get ourselves in trouble in the same kinds of ways, I think, even with the advanced technology.
Yeah, I mean, you do tend to see the same patterns, similar patterns, for civilizations where they go through a life cycle like an organism. Just like a human, this sort of zygote, fetus, baby, toddler, teenager, eventually gets old and dies. The civilizations go through a life cycle. No civilization will last forever.
What do you think it takes for the American empire to not collapse in the near-term future, in the next 100 years, to continue flourishing?
Birth rate.
Well, the single biggest thing that is often actually not mentioned in history books, but Durant does mention it, is the birth rate.
Mm-hmm.
So, perhaps to some, a counterintuitive thing happens when civilizations become are winning for too long. The birth rate declines. It can often decline quite rapidly. We're seeing that throughout the world today. Currently, South Korea is I think maybe the lowest fertility rate, but there are many others that are close to it. It's 0.8, I think. If the birth rate doesn't decline further, South Korea will lose roughly 60% of its population. But every year that birth rate is dropping. And this is true through most of the world. I don't mean to single out South Korea. It's been happening throughout the world. So as soon as any given civilization reaches a level of prosperity, the birth rate drops. And now you can go and look at the same thing happening in ancient Rome. So Julius Caesar took note of this, I think, around 50-ish BC, and tried to pass, I don't know if he was successful, tried to pass a law to give an incentive for any Roman citizen that would have a third child. And I think Augustus was able to, well, he was, the dictator, so this Senate was just for show. I think he did pass a tax incentive for Roman citizens to have a third child, but those efforts were unsuccessful. Rome fell because the Romans stopped making Romans. That's actually the fundamental issue. And there were other things. There was they had quite a series of malaria epidemics and plagues and whatnot. But they had those before. It's just that the birth rate was far lower than the death rate.
It really is that simple.
Well, I'm saying that's
more people.
That's
required
at a fundamental level. If a civilization does not at least maintain its numbers, it will disappear.
So perhaps the amount of compute that the biological computer allocates to sex is justified. In fact, we should probably increase it.
Well, I mean, there's this hedonistic sex, which is, that's neither here nor there.
Yeah.
It's
not productive.
It doesn't produce kids. Well, what matters. I mean, Durant makes this very clear because he's looked at one civilization after another, and they all went through the same cycle. When the civilization was under stress, the birth rate was high. But as soon as there were no external enemies, or they had a extended period of prosperity, the birth rate inevitably dropped every time. I don't believe there's a single exception.
So that's the foundation of it. You need to have people.
Yeah. I mean, it's at a base level,
Yeah.
no humans, no humanity.
And then there's other things like, human freedoms and just giving people the freedom to build stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. But at a basic level, if you do not at least maintain your numbers, if you're below replacement rate and that trend continues, you will eventually disappear. It's just elementary. Now, then, obviously, you also want to try to avoid massive wars. If there's a global thermonuclear war, probably we're all toast. Radioactive toast. So we want to try to avoid those things. Then there's a thing that happens over time with any given civilization, which is that the laws and regulations accumulate, and if there's not some forcing function like a war to clean up the accumulation of laws and regulations, eventually everything becomes legal, and that's like the hardening of the arteries, or a way to think of it is like being tied down by a million little strings, like Gulliver. You can't move. And it's not like any one of those strings is the issue. You got a million of them. So there has to be a sort of a garbage collection for laws and regulations, so that you don't keep accumulating laws and regulations to the point where you can't do anything. This is why we can't build high-speed rail in America. It's illegal. That's the issue. It's illegal 6 ways to Sunday to build high-speed rail in America.
I wish you could just like for a week go into Washington and like be the head of the committee for making, what is it, for the garbage collection, making government smaller, like removing stuff.
I have discussed with Trump the idea of a government efficiency commission.
Nice. Yeah.
Nice.
And I would be willing to be part of that commission.
I wonder how hard that is.
The antibody reaction would be very strong.
Yes. Yeah.
So you really have to. You're attacking the Matrix at that point.
Matrix.
Matrix will fight back.
How are you doing with that? Being
Matrix?
attacked?
Me?
Anh đu thế à? Thì không được đã. Nãy mình ăn một cái sữa chua rồi, hộp sữa chua rồi. Giờ còn một cốc nước cam và một bát chè nữa ở ngoài kia.
Attacked?
Yeah. There's a lot of it. It doesn't-
Yeah, there is a lot. I mean, every day another psyop, you know.
How do
Where's
you,
my tinfoil hat?
how do you keep your just positivity? How do you optimism about the world, a clarity of thinking about the world, so just not become resentful or cynical or all that kind of stuff? Just getting attacked by, you know, a very large number of people, misrepresented.
Yeah, that's like
Lies
that's,
out.
that's a daily occurrence.
Yes.
So, I mean, it does get me down at times. I mean, it makes me sad, but I mean,
Tuổi thơ.
at some point you have to sort of say, look, the attacks are by people that actually don't know me. They're trying to generate clicks. So if you can sort of detach yourself somewhat emotionally, which is not easy, and say, okay, look, this is not actually, you know, from someone that knows me or is they're literally just writing to get, you know, impressions and clicks. Then you know, then I guess it doesn't hurt as much. It's like it's not quite water off a duck's back. Maybe it's like acid off a duck's back.
All right. Well,
Thì Miu ở với
that's good. Just about your own life. What do you use as a measure of success in your life?
Measure of success, I'd say, like how many useful things can I get done?
Day-to-day basis, you wake up in the morning. How can I be useful today?
Yeah. Maximize utility, area under the curve of usefulness. Very difficult to be useful at scale.
At scale. Can you like speak to what it takes to be useful for somebody like you, where there's so many amazing, great teams? Like, how do you allocate your time to be the most useful?
Well, time is the true currency.
Yeah.
So it is tough to say what is the best allocation of time. I mean, there are, you know, often say, if you look at, say, Tesla, I mean, Tesla this year will do over 100 billion in revenue. So that's $2 billion a week. If I make slightly better decisions, I can affect the outcome by $1 billion. So then, you know, I try to do the best decisions I can. And on balance, you know, at least compared to the competition, pretty good decisions. But the marginal value of a better decision can easily be in the course of an hour, $100 million.
Given that, how do you take risks? How do you do the algorithm that you mentioned? I mean, deleting, given that a small thing can be $1 billion. How do you decide to...
Yeah. Well, I think you have to look at it on a percentage basis, because if you look at it in the absolute terms, it's just, I would never get any sleep. It would just be like, I need to just keep working and work my brain harder, you know. And I'm not trying to get as much as possible out of this meat computer. So it's not, it's pretty hard, because you can just work all the time, and at any given point, like I said, a slightly better decision could be $100 million impact for Tesla or SpaceX, for that matter. But it is wild when considering the marginal value of time can be $100 million an hour at times, or more.
Is your own happiness part of that equation of success?
It has to be to some degree. Other than sad, if I'm depressed, I make worse decisions. So I can't have, like, if I have zero recreational time, then I make worse decisions. So I don't have a lot, but it's above zero. I mean, my motivation, if I've got a religion of any kind, is a religion of curiosity, of trying to understand. You know, it's really the mission of Grok, understand the universe. I'm trying to understand the universe, or at least set things in motion such that at some point civilization understands the universe or far better than we do today, and even what questions to ask. As Douglas Adams pointed out in his book, sometimes the answer is arguably the easy part. Trying to frame the question correctly is the hard part. Once you frame the question correctly, the answer is often easy. So I'm trying to set things in motion such that we are at least at some point able to understand the universe. So for SpaceX, the goal is to make life multiplanetary, and which is, you know, if you go to the Fermi paradox of where are the aliens, you've got these sort of great filters. Like, just like why have we not heard from the aliens? Now, a lot of people think there are aliens among us. I often claim to be one. So nobody believes me, but it did say alien registration card at one point on my immigration documents. Registration card at one point on my. It did say alien registration card at one point on my immigration documents.
Yeah.
So I've not seen any evidence of aliens. So it suggests that at least one of the explanations is that intelligent life is extremely rare. And again, if you look at the history of Earth, civilization has only been around for 1/1,000,000th of Earth's existence. So if aliens had visited here, say 100,000 years ago, they would be like, well, they don't even have writing, you know, just hunter-gatherers basically. So, so how long does a civilization last? So, for SpaceX, the goal is to establish a self-sustaining city on Mars. Mars is the only viable planet for such a thing. The moon is close, but it lacks resources, and I think is probably vulnerable to any calamity that takes out Earth. The moon is too close; it's vulnerable to a calamity that takes out Earth. So, I'm not saying we shouldn't have a moon base, but Mars would be far more resilient. The difficulty of getting to Mars is what makes it resilient. In going through these various explanations of why don't we see the aliens, why one of them is that they failed to pass these great filters, these key hurdles, and one of those hurdles is being a multi-planet species. So if you're a multi-planet species, then if something were to happen, whether that was a natural catastrophe or a man-made catastrophe, at least the other planet would probably still be around. So you're not like, you don't have all the eggs in one basket. And once you are sort of a two-planet species, you can obviously extend life perhaps to the asteroid belt, to maybe to the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, and ultimately to other star systems. But if you can't even get to another planet, definitely not getting to star systems.
And the other possible great filters, super powerful technology like AGI, for example. So you're basically trying to knock out one great filter at a time.
Digital superintelligence is possibly a great filter. I hope it isn't, but it might be. Guys like, say, Jeff Hinton would say, he invented a number of the key principles in artificial intelligence. I think he puts the probability of AI annihilation around 10 to 20%, something like that. So, so it's not like, look on the bright side, it's 80% likely to be great. But I think AI risk mitigation is important. Being a multi-planet species would be a massive risk mitigation. And I do want to sort of, once again, emphasize the importance of having enough children to sustain our numbers and not plummet into population collapse, which is currently happening. Population collapse is a real and current thing. So the only reason it's not being reflected in the total population numbers is that as much is because people are living longer. But it's easy to predict, say, what the population of any given country will be. Just take the birth rate last year, how many babies were born, multiply that by life expectancy, and that's what the population will be steady state, unless if the birth rate continues at that level. But if it keeps declining, it will be even less and eventually dwindle to nothing. So I keep, banging on the baby drum here for a reason, because it has been the source of civilizational collapse over and over again throughout history. And so why don't we just not try to stave off that day?
Well, in that way, I have miserably failed civilization, and I'm hoping to fix that. I'd love to have many kids.
Great. Hope you do. No time like the present.
Yeah, I got to allocate more compute to the whole process. But apparently it's not that difficult.
No, it's like unskilled labor.
Well, one of the things you do for me, for the world, is to inspire us with what the future could be. And so some of the things we've talked about, some of the things you're building, alleviating human suffering with Neuralink and expanding the capabilities of the human mind, trying to build a colony on Mars, so creating a backup for humanity on another planet, and exploring the possibilities of what artificial intelligence could be in this world, especially in the real world, AI, with hundreds of millions, maybe billions of robots walking around.
There will be billions of robots. That seems virtual certainty.
Well, thank you for building the future, and thank you for inspiring so many of us to keep building and creating cool stuff, including kids.
Yeah, you're welcome. Go forth and multiply.
Go forth and multiply. Thank you, Elon. Thanks for talking, brother. Thanks for listening to this conversation with Elon Musk. And now, dear friends, here's DJ Saw, the co-founder, president, and COO of Neuralink. When did you first become fascinated by the human brain?
For me, I was always interested in
Trẻ đi. DJ Cell. DJ Cell. Neuralink H. Ba mấy tuổi? Co-founder Neuralink. Trẻ vãi. Đi học ở đâu? Education. Research Fellow. Ba mấy tuổi à? Neuralink 7 năm trước, 2017. 2016, vào năm 2016.
Understanding the purpose of things and how it was engineered to serve that purpose, whether it's organic or inorganic. You know, like we were talking earlier about your curtain holders. They serve a clear purpose and they were engineered with that purpose in mind. And, you know, growing up, I had a lot of interest in seeing things, touching things, feeling things, and trying to really understand the root of how it was designed to serve that purpose. And, you know, obviously, brain is just a fascinating organ that we all carry. It's an infinitely powerful machine that has intelligence and cognition that arise from it. And, you know, we haven't even scratched the surface in terms of how all of that occurs. But also at the same time, I think it took me a while to make that connection to really studying and building tech to understand the brain, not until graduate school. You know, there were a couple of moments, key moments in my life where some of those, I think, influenced how the trajectory of my life got me to studying what I'm doing right now. You know, one was growing up, both sides of my family, my grandparents had a very severe form of Alzheimer's. And it's, you know, incredibly debilitating conditions. I mean, literally, you're seeing someone's whole identity and their mind just losing over time. And I just remember thinking how both the power of the mind, but also how something like that could really lose your sense of identity.
It's fascinating that that is one of the ways to reveal the power of a thing, by watching it lose the power.
Yeah, a lot of what we know about the brain actually comes from these cases where there are trauma to the brain or some parts of the brain that led someone to lose certain abilities. And as a result, there's some correlation and understanding of that part of the tissue being critical for that function. And it's an incredibly fragile organ, if you think about it that way, but also it's incredibly plastic and incredibly resilient in many different ways.
And by the way, the term plastic, as we'll use a bunch, means that it's adaptable. So neuroplasticity refers to the adaptability of the human brain.
Correct. Another key moment that sort of influenced how the trajectory of my life have shaped towards the current focus of my life has been during my teenage year when I came to the US. You know, I didn't speak a word of English. There was a huge language barrier, and there was a lot of struggle to kind of connect with my peers around me because I didn't understand the artificial construct that we have created called language, specifically English in this case. And I remember feeling pretty isolated, not being able to connect with peers around me. So I spent a lot of time just on my own, you know, reading books, watching movies. And I naturally sort of gravitated towards sci-fi books. I just found them really, really interesting. And also it was a great way for me to learn English. You know, some of the first set of books that I picked up are Ender's Game, you know, the whole saga by Orson Scott Card, and Neuromancer from William Gibson, and Snow Crash from Neil Stephenson. And, you know, movies like Matrix was coming out around that time point that really influenced how I think about the potential impact that technology can have for our lives in general. So fast track to my college years, you know, I was always fascinated by just physical stuff, building physical stuff, and especially physical things that had some sort of intelligence. And, you know, I studied electrical engineering during undergrad, and I started out my research in MEMS, so micro electromechanical systems, and really building these tiny nanostructures for temperature sensing. And I just found that to be just incredibly rewarding and fascinating subject to just understand how you can build something miniature like that, that again, served a function and had a purpose. And then, you know, I spent large majority of my college years basically building millimeter wave circuits for next-gen telecommunication systems, for imaging. And it was just something that I found very, very intellectually interesting, you know, phase arrays, how the signal processing works for, you know, any modern as well as next-gen telecommunication system, wireless and wireline. EM waves or electromagnetic waves are fascinating. How do you design antennas that are most efficient in a small footprint that you have? How do you make these things energy efficient? That was something that just consumed my intellectual curiosity. And that journey led me to actually apply to and find myself at a PhD program at UC Berkeley at kind of this consortium called the Berkeley Wireless Research Center that was precisely looking at building, at the time we called it XG, similar to 3G, 4G, 5G, but the next generation G system, and how you would design circuits around that to ultimately go on phones and basically any other devices that are wirelessly connected these days. So I was just absolutely just fascinated by how that entire system works and that infrastructure works. And then also during grad school, I had sort of the fortune of having a couple of research fellowships that led me to pursue whatever project that I want. And that's one of the things that I really enjoyed about my graduate school career, where you got to kind of pursue your intellectual curiosity in the domain that may not matter at the end of the day, but is something that really allows you the opportunity to go as deeply as you want, as well as widely as you want. And at the time, I was actually working on this project called the Smart Band-Aid. And the idea was that when you get a wound, there's a lot of other kind of proliferation of signaling pathway that cells follow to close that wound. And there were hypotheses that when you apply external electric field, you can actually accelerate the closing of that field by having, basically electrotaxing of the cells around that wound site. And specifically, not just for a normal wound, there are chronic wounds that don't heal. So we were interested in building, some sort of a wearable patch that you could apply to kind of facilitate that healing process. And that was in collaboration with Professor Michelle Maharovitz, which was a great addition to kind of my thesis committee, and really shaped the rest of my PhD career.
So this would be the first time you interacted with biology, I suppose.
Correct. I mean, there were some peripheral, end application of the wireless imaging and telecommunication system that I was using for security and bioimaging, but this was a very clear direct application to biology and biological system, and understanding the constraints around that and really designing and engineering electrical solutions around it. So that was my first introduction. And that's also kind of how I got introduced to Michel. He's sort of known for remote control of beetles in the early 2000s. And then around 2013, obviously kind of the holy grail when it comes to implantable system is to kind of understand how small of a thing you can make. And a lot of that is driven by how much energy or how much power you can supply to it and how you extract data from it. So at the time at Berkeley, there was kind of this desire to kind of understand in the neural space what sort of system you can build to really miniaturize these implantable systems. And I distinctively remember this one particular meeting where Michel came in and he's like, "Guys, I think I have a solution. The solution is ultrasound." And then he proceeded to kind of walk through why that is the case. And that really formed the basis for my thesis work called Neural Dust system, that was looking at ways to use ultrasound as opposed to electromagnetic waves for powering as well as communication. I guess I should step back and say the initial goal of the project was to build these tiny, about the size of a neuron, implantable system that can be parked next to a neuron, being able to record its state and being able to ping that back to the outside world for doing something useful. As I mentioned, the size of the implantable system is limited by how you power the thing and get the data off of it. And at the end of the day, fundamentally, if you look at a human body, we're essentially a bag of salt water with some interesting proteins and chemicals, but it's mostly salt water that's very, very well temperature regulated at 37 degrees Celsius. And we'll get into why later why that's an extremely harsh environment for any electronics to survive, as I'm sure you've experienced, or maybe not experienced, dropping cell phone in a salt water in an ocean. It will instantly kill the device, right? But anyways, just in general, electromagnetic waves don't penetrate through this environment well, and just the speed of light, it is what it is. We can't change it, and based on the wavelength at which you are interfacing with the device, the device just needs to be big. Like these inductors needs to be quite big. And the general good rule of thumb is that you want the wavefront to be roughly on the order of the size of the thing that you're interfacing with. So an implantable system that is around 10 to 100 micron in dimension in a volume, which is about the size of a neuron that you see in a human body. you would have to operate at like hundreds of gigahertz, which, number one, not only is it difficult to build electronics operating at those frequencies, but also the body just attenuates that very, very significantly. So the interesting kind of insight of this ultrasound was the fact that ultrasound just travels a lot more effectively in the human body tissue compared to electromagnetic waves. And this is something that you encounter, I'm sure most people have encountered in their lives when you go to, hospitals that are medical ultrasound, sonograph, right? And they go into very, very deep depth without attenuating too much of the signal. So, all in all, ultrasound, the fact that it travels through the body extremely well, and the mechanism to which it travels to the body really well is that just the wavefront is very different. It's electromagnetic waves are transverse, whereas in ultrasound waves are compressive. So it's just a completely different mode of wavefront propagation. And as well as speed of sound is orders and orders of magnitude less than speed of light, which means that even at 10 megahertz ultrasound wave, your wavefront ultimately is a very, very small wavelength. Mm-hmm. So if you're talking about interfacing with the 10 micron or 100 micron type structure, you would have 150 micron wavefront at 10 megahertz, and building electronics at those at those frequencies are much, much easier, and they're a lot more efficient. So the basic idea kind of was born out of using ultrasound as a mechanism for powering the device, and then also getting data back. So now the question is, how do you get the data back? The mechanism to which we landed on is what's called backscattering. This is actually something that is very common and that we interface on a day-to-day basis with our RFID cards, our radio frequency ID tags, where there's actually rarely, in your ID, a battery inside. There's an antenna and there's some sort of coil that has your serial identification ID. And then there's an external device called a reader that then sends a wavefront, and then you reflect back that wavefront with some sort of modulation that's unique to your ID. Mm-hmm. That's what's called backscattering, fundamentally. So the tag itself actually doesn't have to consume that much energy. And that was a mechanism to which we were kind of thinking about sending the data back. So when you have an external ultrasonic transducer that's sending ultrasonic wave to your implant, the neural dust implant, and it records some information about its environment, whether it's a neuron firing or some other state of the tissue that it's interfacing with, and then it just amplitude modulates the wavefront that comes back to the source.
And the recording step would be the only one that requires any energy. So what would require energy in that little step?
Correct. So it is that initial kind of startup circuitry to get that recording, amplifying it, and then just modulating. Mm-hmm. And the mechanism to which that you can enable that is there is this specialized crystal called piezoelectric crystals that are able to convert sound energy into electrical energy and vice versa. So you can kind of have this interplay between the ultrasonic domain and electrical domain that is the biological tissue.
So on the theme of parking very small computational devices next to neurons, that's the dream, the vision of brain-computer interfaces. Maybe before we talk about Neuralink, can you give a sense of the history of the field of BCI? What has been maybe the continued dream, and also some of the milestones along the way with the different approaches and the amazing work done at the various labs?
I think a good starting point is going back to 1790s.
I did not expect that.
Where the concept of animal electricity, or the fact that body is electric, was first discovered by Luigi Galvani, where he had this famous experiment where he connected a set of electrodes to a frog leg and ran current through it, and then it started twitching, and he said, "Oh my goodness, body's electric."
Yeah.
So fast forward many, many years to 1920s, where Hans Berger, who is a German psychiatrist, discovered EEG, or electroencephalography, which is still around. There are these electrode arrays that you wear outside the skull that gives you some sort of neural recording. That was a very, very big milestone that you can record some sort of activities about the human mind. And then in the 1940s, there were these group of scientists, Renshaw, Forbes, and Morrison, that inserted these glass microelectrodes into the cortex and recorded single neurons. The fact that there's signal that are a bit more high resolution and high fidelity as you get closer to the source, let's say. And in the 1950s, these two scientists, Hodgkin and Huxley, showed up, and they built this beautiful, beautiful models of the cell membrane and the ionic mechanism, and had these like circuit diagram. And as someone who's an electrical engineer, it's a beautiful model that's built out of these partial differential equations, talking about flow of ions and how that really leads to how neurons communicate. And they won the Nobel Prize for that 10 years later in the 1960s. So in 1969, Ed Fetz from University of Washington published this beautiful paper called Operant Conditioning of Cortical Unit Activity, where he was able to record a single unit neuron from a monkey and was able to have the monkey modulated based on its activity and reward system. So I would say this is the very, very first example, as far as I'm aware, of closed loop, brain-computer interface, or BCI.
The abstract reads, the activity of single neurons in precentral cortex of anesthetized monkeys was conditioned by reinforcing high rates of neuronal discharge for delivery of a food pellet. Auditory and visual feedback of unit firing rates was usually provided in addition to food reinforcement. Cool. So they actually got it done.
They got it done. This is back in 1969.
After several training sessions, monkeys could increase the activity of newly isolated cells by 50 to 500% above rates before reinforcement. Fascinating.
Brain is very plastic.
And so from here, the number of experiments grew.
Yeah, number of experiments as well as set of tools to interface with the brain have just exploded. I think, and also just understanding the neural code and how some of the cortical layers and the functions are organized. So the other paper that is pretty seminal, especially in the motor decoding, was this paper in the 1980s from Georgiopoulos that discovered that there's this thing called motor tuning curve. So what are motor tuning curves? It's the fact that there are neurons in the motor cortex of mammals, including humans, that have a preferential direction that causes them to fire. So what that means is there are a set of neurons that would increase their spiking activities when you're thinking about moving to the left, right, up, down, and any of those vectors. And based on that, you could start to think, well, if you can identify those essential eigenvectors, you can do a lot, and you can actually use that information for actually decoding someone's intended movement from the cortex. So that was a very, very seminal kind of paper that showed that there is some sort of code that you can extract, especially in the motor cortex.
So there's signal there, and if you measure the electrical signal from the brain, that you could actually figure out what the intention was.
Correct. Yeah, not only electrical signals, but electrical signals from the right set of neurons that give you these preferential direction.
Okay, so going slowly towards Neuralink, one interesting question is, what do I understand on the BCI front on invasive versus non-invasive from this line of work? How important is it to park next to the neuron? What does that get you?
That answer fundamentally depends on what you want to do with it, right? There's actually incredible amount of stuff that you can do with EEG and electrocardiograph, ECOG, which actually doesn't penetrate the cortical layer or parenchyma, but you place a set of electrodes on the surface of the brain. So the thing that I'm personally very interested in is just actually understanding and being able to just really tap into the high resolution, high fidelity understanding of the activities that are happening at the local level. And we can get into biophysics, but just to kind of step back to kind of use analogy, because analogy here can be useful. And sometimes it's a little bit difficult to think about electricity. At the end of the day, we're doing electrical recording that's mediated by ionic currents, movements of these charged particles, which is really, really hard for most people to think about. But turns out a lot of the activities that are happening in the brain and the frequency band with which that's happening is actually very, very similar to sound waves and our normal conversation audible range. So the analogy that typically is used in the field is, if you have a football stadium There's game going on. If you stand outside the stadium, you maybe get a sense of how the game is going based on the cheers and the boos of the home crowd, whether the team is winning or not. But you have absolutely no idea what the score is. You have absolutely no idea what individual audience or the players are talking or saying to each other, what the next play is, what the next goal is. So what you have to do is you have to drop the microphone near into the stadium and then get near the source, like into the individual chatter. In this specific example, you would want to have it, right next to where the huddle is happening. So I think that's kind of a good illustration of what we're trying to do when we say invasive or minimally invasive or implanted brain-computer interfaces versus non-invasive or non-implanted brain interfaces. It's basically talking about where do you put that microphone and what can you do with that information.
So what is the biophysics of the read and write communication that we're talking about here as we now step into the efforts at Neuralink?
Yeah, so brain is made up of these specialized cells called neurons. There's billions of them, tens of billions, sometimes people quote 100 billion, that are connected in this complex yet dynamic network that are constantly remodeling. They're changing their synaptic weights, and that's what we typically call neuroplasticity. And the neurons are also bathed in this charged environment that is laden with many charged molecules like potassium ions, sodium ions, chlorine ions. And those actually facilitate these, through ionic current communication between these different networks. And when you look at a neuron as well, they have these membrane with a beautiful protein structure called the voltage selective ion channels, which, in my opinion, is one of nature's best inventions. In many ways, if you think about what they are, they're doing the job of a modern day transistors. Transistors are nothing more at the end of the day than a voltage-gated conduction channel. And nature found a way to have that very, very early on in its evolution. And as we all know, with the transistor, you can have many, many computation and a lot of amazing things that we have access to today. So I think it's one of those, just as a tangent, just a beautiful, beautiful invention that the nature came up with, these voltage-gated ion channels.
I mean, I suppose there's, on the biological level, at every level of the complexity of the hierarchy of the organism, there's going to be some mechanisms for storing information and for doing computation. And this is just one such way. But to do that with biological and chemical components is interesting. Plus, like, with neurons, I mean, it's not just electricity, it's chemical communication, it's also mechanical. I mean, these are like actual objects that have that vibrate. I mean, they move.
Yeah, they're actually, there's a lot of really, really interesting physics that are involved. And, kind of going back to my work on ultrasound during grad school, there are groups and there were groups and there are still groups looking at ways to cause neurons to actually fire an action potential using ultrasound wave. And the mechanism to which that's happening is still unclear, as I understand. It may just be that, you're imparting some sort of thermal energy and that causes cells to depolarize in some interesting ways. But there are also these ion channels or even membranes that actually just open up its pore as they're being mechanically shook, right? Vibrated. So there's just a lot of, elements of these moved particles, which again, that's governed by diffusion physics, right? Movements of particles. And there's also a lot of kind of interesting physics there.
Also, not to mention, as Roger Penrose talks about, there might be some beautiful weirdness in the quantum mechanical effects of all of this. And he actually believes that consciousness might emerge from the quantum mechanical effects there. So there's physics, there's chemistry, there's biology, all of that is going on there.
Oh yeah. I mean, you can, yes, there's a lot of levels of physics that you can dive into. But yeah, in the end, you have these membranes with these voltage-gated ion channels that selectively let membranes with these voltage-gated ion channels that selectively let these charged molecules that are in the extracellular matrix in and out. And these neurons generally have these resting potential where there's a voltage difference between inside the cell and outside the cell. And when there's some sort of stimuli that changes the state such that they need to send information to the downstream network, you start to kind of see these like sort of orchestration of these different molecules going in and out of these channels. They also open up, like more of them open up once it reaches some threshold to a point where you have a depolarizing cell that sends an action potential. So it's just a very beautiful kind of orchestration of these molecules. And what we're trying to do when we place an electrode or parking it next to a neuron is that you're trying to measure these local changes in the potential. Again, mediated by the movements of the ions. And what's interesting, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of physics involved. And the two dominant physics for this electrical recording domain is diffusion physics and electromagnetism. And where one dominates, where Maxwell's equation dominates versus Fick's law dominates, depends on where your electrode is. If it's close to the source, mostly electromagnetic based. When you're farther away from it, it's more diffusion based. So essentially, when you're able to park it next to it, you can listen in on those individual chatter and those local changes in the potential. And the type of signal that you get are these canonical textbook neural spiking waveform. The moment you're further away, and based on some of the studies that people have done, Christoph Koch's lab and others, once you're away from that source by roughly around 100 micron, which is about width of a human hair, you no longer hear from that neuron. You're no longer able to kind of have the system sensitive enough to be able to record that particular local membrane potential change in that neuron. And just to kind of give you a sense of scale, also, when you look at a 100 micron voxel, so 100 micron by 100 micron by 100 micron box in a brain tissue, there's roughly around 40 neurons and whatever number of connections that they have. So there's a lot in that volume of tissue. So the moment you're outside of that, there's just no hope that you'll be able to detect that change from that one specific neuron that you may care about.
Yeah, but as you're moving about this space, you'll be hearing other ones. So if you move another 100 micron, you'll be hearing chatter from another community.
Correct.
And so the whole sense is you want to place as many as possible electrodes, and then you're listening to the chatter.
Yeah, you want to listen to the chatter, and at the end of the day, you also want to basically let the software do the job of decoding. And just to kind of go to why ECOG and EEG work at all, right? When you have these local changes, obviously it's not just this one neuron that's activating. There's many other networks that are activating all the time, and you do see sort of a general change in the potential of this it's a charged medium. And that's what you're recording when you're farther away. I mean, you still have some reference electrode that's stable and the brain that's just electroactive organ. And you're seeing some combination aggregate action potential changes. And then you can pick it up, right? It's a much slower changing signals, but there are these like canonical kind of oscillations and waves, like gamma waves, beta waves, like when you sleep, that can be detected because there's sort of a synchronized kind of global effect of the brain that you can detect. And I mean, the physics of this go, like, I mean, if we really want to go down that rabbit hole, like there's a lot that goes on in terms of like why diffusion physics at some point dominates when you're further away from the source. It's just a charged medium. So similar to how when you have electromagnetic waves propagating in atmosphere or in a charged medium like a plasma, there's this weird shielding that happens that actually further attenuates the signal as you move away from it. So yeah, you see, like if you do a really, really deep dive on kind of the signal attenuation over distance, you start to see kind of 1 over r squared in the beginning and then exponential drop off. And that's the knee at which, you go from electromagnetism dominating to diffusion physics dominating.
But once again, with the electrodes, the biophysics that you need to understand is not as deep because no matter where you're placing it, you're listening to a small crowd of local neurons.
Correct. Yeah. So once you penetrate the brain, you're in the arena, so to speak.
And there's a lot of neurons.
There are many of them.
But then again, there's a whole field of neuroscience that's studying like how the different groupings, the different sections of the seating in the arena, what they usually are responsible for, which is where the metaphor probably falls apart because the seating is not that organized in an arena.
Also, most of them are silent. they don't really do much. You know, or their activities are, you know, you have to hit it with just the right set of stimulus.
So they're usually quiet.
They're usually very quiet.
Yeah.
Quiet. There's, I mean, similar to dark energy and dark matter, there's dark neurons. What are they all doing? When you place these electrode, again, like within this 100 micron volume, you have 40 or so neurons. Like, why do you not see 40 neurons? Why do you see only a handful? What is happening there?
Well, they're mostly quiet, but like when they speak, they say profound shit, I think. That's the way I'd like to think about it. Anyway, before we zoom in even more, let's zoom out. So how does Neuralink work? From the surgery to the implant to the signal and the decoding process and the human being able to use the implant to actually affect the world outside. And all of this, I'm asking in the context of there's a gigantic historic milestone that Neuralink just accomplished in January of this year, putting a Neuralink implant in the first human being, Nolan. And there's been a lot to talk about there about his experience because he's able to describe all the nuance and the beauty and the fascinating complexity of that experience, of everything involved. But on the technical level, how does Neuralink work?
Yeah, so there are three major components to the technology that we're building. One is the device, the thing that's actually recording these neural chatters. We call it N1 implant or the link. And we have a surgical robot that's actually doing an implantation of these tiny, tiny wires that we call threads that are, you know, smaller than human hair. And once everything is surgerized, you have these neural signals, these spiking neurons that are coming out of the brain. And you need to have some sort of software to decode what the users intend to do with that. So there's what's called a Neuralink application or B1 app that's doing that translation. It's running the very, very simple machine learning model that decodes these inputs that are neural signals and then convert it to a set of outputs that allows you know, our participant, first participant Nolan, to be able to control a cursor on the screen.
And this is done wirelessly.
And this is done wirelessly. So we our implant is actually two-part. The link has you know, these flexible tiny wires called threads that have multiple electrodes along its length, and they're only inserted into the cortical layer, which is about 3 to 5 millimeters in a human brain, in the motor cortex region. That's where the kind of the intention for movement lies in. And we have 64 of these threads, each thread having 16 electrodes along, you know, the span of 3 to 4 millimeters, separated by 200 microns. So you can actually record along the depth of the insertion. And based on that signal, there's custom, you know, integrated circuit or ASIC that we built that amplifies the neural signals that you're recording and then digitizing it, and then has some mechanism for detecting whether there was an interesting event, that is a spiking event, and decide to send that or not send that through Bluetooth to an external device, whether it's a phone or a computer that's running this Neuralink application.
So there's onboard signal processing already just to decide whether this is an interesting event or not. So there is some computational power on board inside in addition to the human brain.
Yeah, so it does the signal processing to kind of really compress the amount of signal that you're recording. So we have a total of 1,000 electrodes sampling at you know, just under 20 kilohertz with 10 bit each. So that's 200 megabits that's coming through to the chip from 1,000 channel simultaneous neural recording, and that's quite a bit of data. And you know, there are technology available to send that off wirelessly, but being able to do that in a very, very thermally constrained environment that is a brain. So there has to be some amount of compression that happens to send off only the interesting data that you need, which in this particular case for motor decoding is occurrence of a spike or not, and then being able to use that to
Just you. Làm bắt trẻ đi.
you know, decode
Shadow
the
down.
intended cursor
No
movement.
one.
So the implant itself processes it, figures out whether a spike happened or not with our spike detection algorithm, and then sends it off, packages it, send it off through Bluetooth to an external device that then has the model to decode, okay, based on these spiking inputs, did Nolan wish to go up, down, left, right, or click, or right click, or whatever?
All of this is really fascinating, but let's stick on the N1 implant itself. So the thing that's in the brain. So I'm looking at a picture of it. There's an enclosure. There's a charging coil. So we didn't talk about the charging, which is fascinating. The battery, the power electronics, the antenna. Then there's the signal processing electronics. I wonder if there's more kinds of signal processing you can do. That's another question. And then there's the threads themselves with the enclosure on the bottom. So maybe to ask about the charging. So there's a external charging device.
Yeah, there's an external charging device. So yeah, the second part of the implant, the threads are the ones, again, just the last 3 to 5 millimeters are the ones that are actually penetrating the cortex. Yeah. Rest of it is, actually most of the volume is occupied by the battery, rechargeable battery. And it's about the size of a quarter. I actually have a device here if you want to take a look at it. This is the flexible thread component of it, and then this is the implant. So it's about the size of a US quarter. It's about 9 millimeter thick. So basically this implant, once you have the craniectomy and the thoracotomy, threads are inserted, and the hole that you created, this craniectomy, gets replaced with that. So basically that thing plugs that hole, and you can screw in these self-drilling cranial screws to hold it in place. And at the end of the day, once you have the skin flap over, there's only about 2 to 3 millimeters that's obviously transitioning off of the top of the implant to where the screws are, and that's the minor bump that you have.
Those threads look tiny. That's incredible. That is really incredible. That is really incredible. And also, as you're right, most of the actual volume is the battery.
Yeah.
Wow, this is way smaller than I realized.
They are also, the threads themselves are quite strong.
They look strong.
And the thread themselves also has a very interesting feature at the end of it called a loop. And that's the mechanism to which the robot is able to interface and manipulate this tiny hair-like structure.
And they're tiny. So what's the width of a thread?
Yeah, so the width of a thread starts from 16 micron and then tapers out to about 84 micron. So, average human hair is about 80 to 100 micron in width.
This thing is amazing. This thing is amazing.
Yes, most of the volume is occupied by the battery, rechargeable lithium-ion cell, and the charging is done through inductive charging, which is actually very commonly used. Your cell phone, most cell phones have that. The biggest difference is that for us, usually when you have a phone and you want to charge it on a charging pad, you don't really care how hot it gets. Whereas for us, it matters. There's a very strict regulation and good reasons to not actually increase the surrounding tissue temperature by 2 degrees Celsius. So there's actually a lot of innovation that is packed into this to allow charging of this implant without causing that temperature threshold to reach. And even small things like you see this charging coil and temperature threshold to reach. And even small this implant without this to
không biết, nhưng mà mình tự dưng thấy cái đồng hồ của Lex hơi khác cái đồng hồ mà Joe Rogan đã tặng. Mà chắc là nó chỉ góc thôi, một cái góc khác, cho nên là nó bị phản chiếu, nó tạo ra cái màu khác, màu của mặt đồng hồ khác.
To allow charging of this implant without causing that temperature threshold to reach. And even small things like you see this charging coil and what's called a ferrite shield, right? So without that ferrite shield, what you end up having when you have resonant inductive charging is that the battery itself is a metallic can, and you form these eddy currents from external charger, and that causes heating, and that actually contributes to inefficiency in charging. So this ferrite shield, what it does is that it actually concentrate that field line away from the battery and then around the coil that's actually wrapped around it.
There's a lot of really fascinating design here. to make it? I mean, you're integrating a computer into a complex biological system.
Yeah, there's a lot of innovation here. I would say that part of what enabled this was just the innovations in the wearable. There's a lot of really, really powerful, tiny, low power microcontrollers, temperature sensors, or various different sensors, and power electronics. A lot of innovation really came in the charging coil design, how this is packaged, and how do you enable charging such that you don't really exceed that temperature limit, which is not a constraint for other devices out there.
So let's talk about the threads themselves, those tiny, tiny, tiny things. So how many of them are there? You mentioned 1,000 electrodes. How many threads are there? And what do the electrodes have to do with the threads?
Yeah, so the current instantiation of the device has 64 threads, and each thread has 16 electrodes for a total of 1,024 electrodes that are capable of both recording and stimulating. The thread is basically this polymer insulated wire. The metal conductor is the kind of a tiramisu cake of gold plat tie. And they're very, very tiny wires, 2 micron in width, so 2/1,000,000th of meter.
It's crazy that thing I'm looking at has the polymer insulation, has the conducting material, and has 16 electrodes at the end of it.
On each of those threads.
Yeah, on each of those threads.
Correct.
16, each one of those.
Yes, you're not going to be able to see it with naked eyes.
And I mean, to state the obvious, or maybe for people who are just listening, they're flexible.
Yes. That's also one element that was incredibly important for us. So each of these threads are, as I mentioned, 16 micron in width, and then they taper to 84 micron, but in thickness, they're less than 5 micron. And in thickness is mostly, polyimide at the bottom and this metal track, and then another polyimide. So 2 micron of polyimide, 400 nanometer of this metal stack, and 2 micron of polyimide sandwiched together to protect it from the environment that is 37 degrees C bag of salt water.
So what's maybe can you speak to some interesting aspects of the material design here? Like, what does it take to design a thing like this and to be able to manufacture a thing like this for people who don't know anything about this kind of thing?
Yeah, so the material selection that we have is not, I don't think it was particularly unique. There were other labs, and there are other labs that are kind of looking at similar material stack. There's kind of a fundamental question and still needs to be answered around the longevity and reliability of these microelectrodes that we call, compared to some of the other more conventional neural interfaces devices that are intracranial, so penetrating the cortex, that are more rigid, like the Utah array, that are these 4x4 millimeter kind of silicon shank that have exposed recording site at the end of it. That's been kind of the innovation from Richard Norman back in 1997. It's called the Utah array because he was at University of Utah.
And what does the Utah array look like? So it's a rigid type of
so we can actually look it up. Yeah. Yeah, so it's a bed of needle. There's
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Those are rigid shank.
Rigid. Yeah, you weren't kidding.
And the size and the number of shanks vary anywhere from 64 to 128. At the very tip of it is an exposed electrode that actually records neural signal. The other thing that's interesting to note is that unlike Neuralink threads that have recording electrodes that are actually exposed iridium oxide recording sites along the depth, this is only at a single depth. So these Utah array spokes can be anywhere between 0.5 millimeters to 1.5 millimeter. And they also have designs that are slanted, so you can have it inserted at different depth. But that's one of the other big differences. And then, the main key difference is the fact that there's no active electronics. These are just electrodes. And then there's a bundle of a wire that you're seeing. And then that actually then exits the craniectomy, that then has this port that you can connect to for any external electronic devices. They are working on or have the wireless telemetry device, but it still requires a through the skin port that actually is one of the biggest failure modes for infection for the system.
What are some of the challenges associated with flexible threads? Like, for example, on the robotics side, R1. implanting those threads. How difficult is that task?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, they're very, very difficult to maneuver by hand. These youth arrays that you saw earlier, they're actually inserted by a neurosurgeon actually positioning it near the site that they want, and then there's a pneumatic hammer that actually pushes them in. So it's a pretty simple process, and they're easy to maneuver. But for these thin film arrays, they're very, very tiny and flexible, so they're very difficult to maneuver. So that's why we built an entire robot to do that. There are other reasons for why we built the robot, and that is ultimately we want this to help millions and millions of people that can benefit from this, and there just aren't that many neurosurgeons out there. Robots can be something that we hope can actually do large parts of the surgery. But the robot is this entire other sort of category of product that we're working on, and it's essentially this multi-axis gantry system that has the specialized robot head that has all of the optics and this kind of a needle retracting mechanism that maneuvers these threads via this loop structure that you have on the thread.
So the thread already has a loop structure by which you can grab it.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
So this is fascinating. So you mentioned optics. So there's a robot, R1. So for now, there's a human that actually creates a hole in the skull. And then after that, there's a computer vision component that's finding a way to avoid the blood vessels. And then you're grabbing it by the loop, each individual thread, and placing it in a particular location to avoid the blood vessels. And also choosing the depth of placement, all that.
Correct.
Kind of stuff. So controlling the 3D geometry of the placement.
Correct. So the aspect of this robot that is unique is that it's not surgeon assisted or human assisted. It's a semi-automatic or automatic robot. Once obviously there are human component to it when you're placing targets. You can always move it away from kind of major vessels that you see. But I mean, we want to get to a point where one click and it just does the surgery within minutes.
So the computer vision component finds great targets, candidates, and the human kind of approves them. And the robot does it do like one thread at a time, or does it do?
It does one thread at a time, and that's actually also one thing that we are looking at ways to do multiple threads at a time. There's nothing stopping from it. You can have multiple kind of engagement mechanisms, but right now it's one by one, and we also still do quite a bit of just kind of verification to make sure that it got inserted. If so, how deep? Did it actually match what was programmed in, and so on and so forth. And
the actual electrodes are placed at differing depths in the there's very small differences, but differences.
Yeah.
And so that there's some reasoning behind that, as you mentioned, like it gets more varied signal.
Yeah, we try to place them all around 3 or 4 millimeter from the surface, just because the span of the electrode, those 16 electrodes that we currently have in this version, spans roughly around 3 millimeters. So we want to get all of those in the brain.
This is fascinating. Okay, so there's a million questions here. If we go zoom in specifically on the electrodes, so what is your sense? How many neurons is each individual electrode listening to?
Yeah, each electrode can record from anywhere between 0 to 40, as I mentioned, right, earlier. But practically speaking, we only see about, at most, like 2 to 3. And you can actually distinguish which neuron it's coming from by the shape of the spikes.
Oh, cool.
So I mentioned the spike detection algorithm that we have. It's called BOSS algorithm, Buffer Online Spike Sorter.
Nice.
It actually outputs, at the end of the day, 6 unique values, which are kind of the amplitude of these like negative going hump, middle hump, like positive going hump, and then also the time at which these happen. And from that, you can have kind of a statistical probability estimation of, is that a spike? Is it not a spike? And then based on that, you could also determine, oh, that spike looks different than that spike, must come from a different neuron.
Okay, so that's a nice signal processing step from which you can then make much better predictions about if there's a spike, especially in this kind of context where there could be multiple neurons screaming. And that also results in you being able to compress the data better. And inside a DIM. Okay, that's
And just to be clear, I mean, the labs do this what's called spike sorting. Usually, once you have these like broadband, like the fully digitized signals, and then you run a bunch of different set of algorithms to kind of tease apart. It's just all of this for us is done on the device.
on the device.
In a very low power, custom, built ASIC digital processing unit.
highly
where-
heat constrained.
highly heat constrained, and the processing time from signal going in and giving you the output is less than a microsecond, which is a very, very short amount of time.
Oh yeah, so the latency has to be super short.
Correct.
Oh wow. Oh, that's a pain in the ass.
Yeah,
That's
latency
really
is this
tough.
huge thing that you have to deal with. Right now, the biggest source of latency comes from the Bluetooth. The way in which they're packetized, and we bin them in 15 millisecond.
Oh, interesting.
time
So it's
window.
communication constraint. Is there some potential innovation there on the protocol used?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, Bluetooth is definitely not our final wireless communication protocol that we want to get to. It's a highly
Hence the N1 and the R1. I imagine that increases. That will go
NX, RX.
yeah, that's the communication protocol, because Bluetooth allows you to communicate against farther distances than you need to, so you can go much shorter.
Yeah, the primary motivation for choosing Bluetooth is that, I mean, everything has Bluetooth.
All right, so you can talk
so
to any device.
Interoperability is just absolutely essential, especially in this early phase. And in many ways, if you can access a phone or a computer, you can do anything.
Well, it'll be interesting to step back and actually look at, again, the same pipeline that you mentioned for Nolan. So what does this whole process look like, from finding and selecting a human being to the surgery to the first time he's able to use this thing?
So we have what's called a patient registry that people can sign up to hear more about the updates. And that was a route to which Nolan applied. And the process is that once the application comes in, it contains some medical records, and we based on their medical eligibility, that there's a lot of different inclusion and exclusion criteria for them to meet. And we go through a pre-screening interview process with someone from Neuralink. And at some point, we also go out to their homes to do a BCI home audit. Because one of the most kind of revolutionary part about having this N1 system that is completely wireless is that you can use it at home. Like, you don't actually have to go to the lab and go to the clinic to get connectorized to these like specialized equipment that you can't take home with you. So that's one of the key elements of when we're designing the system that we wanted to keep in mind. Like, people hopefully would want to be able to use this every day in the comfort of their homes. And so part of our engagement and what we're looking for during PCI home audit is to just kind of understand their situation, what other assistive technology that they use.
And we should also step back and kind of say that the estimate is 180,000 people live with quadriplegia in the United States, and each year an additional 18,000 suffer a paralyzing spinal cord injury. So these are folks who have a lot of challenges living a life in terms of accessibility, in terms of doing the things that many of us just take for granted day to day. And one of the goals of this initial study is to enable them to have sort of digital autonomy, where they by themselves can interact with a digital device using just their mind, something that you're calling telepathy. So digital telepathy, where a quadriplegic can communicate with a digital device in all the ways that we've been talking about. Control the mouse cursor enough to be able to do all kinds of stuff, including play games and tweet and all that kind of stuff. And there's a lot of people for whom the basics of life are difficult because of the things that have happened to them. So
Yeah, I mean, movement is so fundamental to our existence. I mean, even speaking involves movement of mouth, lip, larynx, and without that, it's extremely debilitating. And there are many people that we can help. And I mean, especially if you start to kind of look at other forms of movement disorders that are not just from spinal cord injury, but from ALS, MS, or even stroke, that leads you, or just aging, right? That leads you to lose some of that mobility, that independence. It's extremely debilitating.
And all of these are opportunities to help people, to help alleviate suffering, to help improve the quality of life. But each of the things you mentioned is its own little puzzle. Then you to have increasing levels of capability from a device like a Neuralink device. And so the first one you're
Ok, hôm nay xem đến đây thôi, được 2 tiếng 27 phút, còn cỡ 6 tiếng 10 phút nữa. Nhiều á, nhưng mà để mai tính nhé. Rồi, bye bye.